You ready?
Yep.
Good evening. Welcome to our weekly Sparks tidbits on the weekly Parsha. I said Parsha, which is the singular, and this is one Parsha, but actually it's a double header, and perhaps even a triple header. Double headers are the combination of two Parshas that are read together on the Shabbos. See, the problem is we have 52 weeks in a solar year. In a lunar year, there's actually 50 weeks in the average lunar year, plus a few days. And there are 54, 53, 54. The reason why I say 53, 54 is because there's one parsha that is really one, but it's split into two. If you count that as two, then it's 54. So you have more parshas than you have weeks. So in a regular year, which means a lunar year that has 354, 355 or 356 days, you have to consolidate some of the Torah readings. And this is one of the Torah readings that is consolidated in most years. In a leap year, which in a Jewish calendar means we add an extra month, so we have an extra 4 weeks, these two parshas are separated. This year is not a leap year, so we read Vayakhel and Pekudei together. So it's the first double header, and I don't know if what I'm saying now is serious or not, but maybe it is. Spring training begins about the time that we read this parsha every year. So maybe the Torah already predicted that this is a time for double headers. When I said before this might be a triple header is because in addition to the regular parsha, which is two parshas combined, we also add on a special Torah reading, one of 4 special Torah readings in this time of the year. It's the last of the 4. It's called Parsha HaChodesh, the section which talks about the new month and the laws of Passover. And it's understandably appropriate to read this at this time of the year because we're preparing for the holiday of Passover. At any rate, Vayakhel Pekudei is a double parsha, but it's really one when we read them together, because the person who gets called up to the third aliyah, the third section, crosses over into the second parsha. In other words, we read the end of the first parsha for the third aliyah, the third person who gets called up to the Torah at the third, and that takes us into the next parsha. So it straddles both parshas, pointing to the fact that they really one, two that have become one. So what is the significance of this? Whenever we talk about two that become one, it means that, yes, there are two separate themes, but somehow they're intertwined and interwoven. What are the two themes of Vayakhel and Pekudei? As the Rebbe points out, Vayakhel means, and he gathered. It talks about how Moses, when he returned from Mount Sinai for the third time with the second tablets, he comes down on the mountain, from the mountain, and the next day he gathers all the people to give them the instructions about the construction of the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary in the desert. So this parsha is called Vayakhel. He gathered all the Jewish people together into one congregation. So it talks about community, the collective nature of the Jewish people, how they're all together. What is Pekudei? The second parsha is about Pekudei. What does the word Pekudei mean? In the context of the Torah, in this parsha, it means the accounting. Moses gives an accounting of the various materials that went into the construction of the sanctuary. Now, if we analyze the names, Vayakhel indicates collectiveness, community, whereas Pekudei, accounting, implies focusing on the details. When you make an accounting, you're counting each individual item separately. So the answer to that is that it's not a contradiction. Judaism works in two different modes, two different modalities. Judaism focuses on community, and Judaism focuses on individuality. There were cultures that believed that the individual's rights and needs and interests have to be sacrificed for the community. And on the other hand, there are ideologies that believe that there should be individual freedom and that that individual should have no governmental authority over him or her, more like a type of anarchy. Judaism says both are extremely important. Judaism has a concept of collectiveness, a tzibur, a community, which combines within it all segments, and it also has a focus on the individual. When we read each Parsha separately, we focus on each one as an individual entity. Parshas Vayakhel tells us, focus on community. Surrender your individuality to the needs of the community. When we read Pekudei the next week, it says, don't lose your focus on the individual. People who can see the forest but not the trees, and there are people who can see the trees and not the forest. When we read Vayakhel, we focus on the forest. When we read Pekudei, we focus on the trees. When we read Vayakhel and Pekudei together, that means even when we're focusing on the community, we see the individual. Even as we see the individual, we focus on the community. I'd like to share an interesting article that was written by Dr. Hillel Zeidman. He was a Holocaust survivor and a journalist, and he had a relationship with the Rebbe. He would come to the Rebbe, this is what he writes in his article, he would come to the Rebbe for a private meeting, we call that Yechidus, an audience with the Rebbe, and the Rebbe would show so much interest in his family and all their needs, but nevertheless, invariably, the Rebbe would then steer the discussion from the individual to the community, what he's doing for the community. Then he would come to a Farbrengen, a gathering where thousands of people would listen to the Rebbe's talks. It was a very communal type of activity, and the Rebbe's focused on world events and things that are earth-shattering and relevant to the whole community. And then in between talks, the Rebbe turns around to him, to Dr. Zeidman, and he starts talking to him about himself and about his family members. And he said this is a remarkable thing, and he felt that was unique to the Rebbe, that when he was talking about individuals, he steered it to the community. When he was talking about community, he steered it to the individual. That's Vayakhel Pekudei together. Now, when you start reading the Parsha Vayakhel Pekudei, there is something that hits you in the face. You can't avoid it. What is the subject matter? The Mishkan, the tabernacle. Oh, again the Mishkan? We had 2 whole sections about it, the week before last week and the week before that. Last week we had a little bit about it, and now we're going to read Vayakhel and Pekudei will be about the Mishkan. And they had little tidbits about the Mishkan in later sections in the book of Leviticus. Why this obsession with the Mishkan? In an earlier class, I think we discussed it. I'll just repeat it briefly, that the Mishkan is the place that God said, I will dwell in it, dwell in you through it. So why is that so exciting that you want to repeat it over and over again? Because it's a love letter. When someone gets a love letter from a loved one that they haven't seen in a long time, they've been very distant from that person, they will read that love letter over and over. It's not because the details are so exciting necessarily, but because it's something that is so precious, because it reflects the love of the person, in the case of a person, to the one who is being loved. In this case, God to us. But it's especially poignant considering the fact when the Mishkan's construction took place. It took place after God was very unhappy with us because of the golden calf sin. And as a result of the golden calf, we lost our close relationship, our intimate relationship with God, to the point that where Moses shattered the tablets when he came down from Mount Sinai and saw us worshiping the golden calf. So when Moses goes up to the mountain and he comes down with the second tablets, that was an indication on Yom Kippur that God had forgiven us, but it still didn't demonstrate that God is willing to be intimate with us again. So he tells us to build the Mishkan in which and through which he will dwell within the Jewish community. When we saw that God was willing to show us the same level of love that he demonstrated before the golden calf, that was what got us to be excited about the Mishkan. Number one, God is excited about it because he wants to show this is the love I have for you, and we got excited about it. Anytime you repeat a name, when the Torah says Avraham, Avraham, Abraham, Abraham, when God calls out to him, and the same thing with other righteous people. So our sages tell us that anytime the name is repeated, it's a lashon chiba, it's an expression of love and affection. So repetition is to be taken as a sign of love and affection. We also know, the Midrash tells us, that whenever the Torah repeats a phrase, a word, a phrase, it's an expression of redemption. Because when you say something once, it has a limit. It has its form. When you say it a second time, you're saying ad infinitum. Take this to the extent that you can take it, which is forever. It represents infinity. That's a sign of redemption, a time when we will be exposed to the infinite energy of God. Where did we get a sample of that infinite energy even before the Messianic age? That was in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, the sanctuary in the desert, and later on in the Beis Hamikdash that we built in Jerusalem and will soon be rebuilding, reconstructing with the coming of Mashiach imminently. Now, when did this gathering occur? Rashi says, although it doesn't say that in the Torah text itself, but Rashi says it occurred the day after Yom Kippur, the day after Moses descends from the mountain with the second tablets. That day itself was a pretty powerful day. Moses comes back, you can imagine, his face was shining, radiant. There was no time for speeches. The next day, that's when Moses gathered everyone and tells them to build the Mishkan. Now what you have over here is an interesting dynamic. The world, according to the Sefer Yetzirah, the book of formation, which is the secret text of Kabbalah that deals with creation, attributed to Abraham. In that book, it says that everything in existence is divided into three categories. Olam, world, space, Shana, which means year or time, Nefesh, soul, or energy. Nothing else exists. Either it occupies space, and that's not true only about physical objects. Spiritual ideas, concepts also occupy space. Not physical space, but you wouldn't put mathematics in a book about psychology. It's a separate, well, maybe you would. There's statistics in psychology. But you wouldn't take concepts of one subject and put it in another area which has its own space, its own parameters. And everything is subject to the changes of time, and everything has a soul, has an energy in it. When you talk about these three, and you get the greatest or the highest of each, and you put them together, that's the most powerful force. Who is the highest and greatest soul, force of energy in this world? Moses. No other human being until Mashiach has the energy, the power, the spirituality, the intimacy with God as Moses did. So in terms of nefesh, soul, he is the highest soul. No one is higher than him. No force of energy in this world could compare to that of Moshe, that of Moses. When you talk about time, what is the holiest day of the year? Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. There's no other day that is as holy as the Day of Atonement. When you talk about space, which is the holiest space in the world? The Mishkan, the sanctuary, later on the Beis Hamikdash. And here you have all three elements coming together. This is the most powerful conglomeration of energy, of space, of time, into one very powerful force. That's what happens in this Vayakhel. Now, the Torah tells us that God tells Moses, and Moses gathers the people to tell them about building the Mishkan. But before he tells them about building the Mishkan, he throws in another commandment. In verse 2, he talks about 6 days work may be done, but the seventh day shall be holy for you, a day of complete rest for God. Whoever does work on it shall be put to death. You shall not kindle fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. Why is the Shabbos inserted in here? The Shabbos was already mentioned in the Ten Commandments. And the answer is, it's to teach us, as Rashi says over here, that you do not you do not build the Mishkan on the Shabbos. You have to postpone it till after Shabbos. Why is it mentioned over here? It was already indicated in the earlier Parsha that building the Mishkan, building the temple, does not override the Shabbos. And the answer is in light of what I said before. When the Jewish people realized what the Mishkan represented, it represented God saying, I'm going to dwell amongst you, they would have rushed to build it no matter what. Shabbos, weekdays, they would want it as quickly as possible. Maybe God will change his mind. God doesn't change his mind. But something that you really love, you're going to rush to do. You're not going to take your time. You're not going to tarry. And they might want to do it on Shabbos. So even though they were already told not to do it on Shabbos, Mishkan does not override the Shabbos. That was already indicated in last week's portion. Nevertheless, over here it had to be emphasized so that they don't go ahead and build a Mishkan. Now, why is it that Shabbos comes ahead of the building of the Mishkan? Because, and the question is asked also, once the Mishkan was built, once the temple later on was built, they would bring sacrifices on Shabbos. Not only were they permitted to do it, they were required to do it. There was a daily offering on Shabbos, 2 daily offerings, a musaf, an additional offering. And all offerings required actions that are forbidden on Shabbos. Why then, if that was okay, why couldn't they build it on Shabbos? And the answer, in short, is when you want to construct something holy, you have to do it without any compromise, without any deviation. You want the Mishkan to be holy, it has to be done in a holy context, by observing the Shabbos. After the Mishkan is built, then it elevates even the things that are normally not permitted, they can be done in the Mishkan. Now, this doesn't mean that in a synagogue you're allowed to do anything that you couldn't do outside of a synagogue. It just meant that those specific sacrifices that the Torah mandated on Shabbos, that was permitted. Now, the Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev says there's another connection that Shabbos has to the Mishkan. What is Shabbos a reminder of? The creation of the world. We rest on the seventh day as if to say to God, not even as if, but it is saying to God, we recognize that you are the creator. You created the world in 6 days, and the seventh day you rested. So the whole idea of Shabbos is to get us to appreciate the role of the creator of the world. That the world is not just here because it just happened. The world is continuously being created by God. What was the Mishkan? A sanctuary, very nice, a building in which God's presence was felt. That's all true. But the Kabbalists tell us that the Mishkan was designed by its architect, whose name was Bezalel. They named the architectural art school in Israel after him. Bezalel was the architect. He knew all the different forces that went into creation, and he used those forces to build the Mishkan. So if anyone else would have built it, it would have been a nice structure. Architecturally, it might be not so significant. But that Mishkan was actually a model of the whole universe. The whole universe, all the energy of the universe was concentrated in that Mishkan. So his creation of the Mishkan involved God's forces. He channeled God's forces to create that Mishkan. That's why not everyone could have done that. The word Bitzalel is a composite of 2 words, which mean in the shadow or the shade of God. He was in God's shadow, so he was able to understand what are the secret forces that go into creation. So both Shabbos focuses on creation and the Mishkan focuses on creation. Shabbos focuses on it in terms of time, and the Mishkan focuses on Shabbos in terms of space. And if I want to take this a step further, Rebbe Levi Yitzchak doesn't mention this, the Talmud says that a Talmud Chacham literally it means a student of the wise, but it means a great Torah scholar is like Shabbos. That's Shabbos in terms of soul, in terms of energy. Because what is the Talmud Chacham doesn't just mean your standard Torah scholar. They come a dime a dozen. Here we're talking about the holiest people of the world. They are students of God's Chachma, of God's wisdom. And in them, there is the power for the whole universe. That's why the Talmud says that when a tzaddik decrees, God follows his decree. Why? It's not that the tzaddik is separate or independent from God. If that was the case, he wouldn't have any power whatsoever. The greatness of the tzaddik is that he is not independent, that he channels God's energy, and through him, the world is sustained. The world is sustained through the righteousness and the merits of the righteous. So we have all three coming together here once more. We have the Shabbos, which is the element of time relating to creation. We have the Mishkan in terms of space. And we have Moshe, or Betzalel, both of them, in terms of nefesh, in terms of soul, in terms of energy. Let's go on. Later on, the Torah describes the different things that went into the construction of the Mishkan. And then it talks about the women. In verse 25 of chapter 38, it talks about how the women did something very unique. It says they spun the wool. And they spun the wool of the goats in verse 26. And Rashi said that they had this unique talent that they were able to spin the wool even before it was shorn from the goats. I don't know if anyone has that talent today, but that was a unique talent that the women had. In general, the women demonstrated greater enthusiasm to build the Mishkan than the men. They brought their contributions before the men. They dragged the men along with them, in contrast to the Egel, the golden calf, where Aaron asked for the women to give their earrings, asked the husbands to get it from their wives, and they refused to give it. But for the Mishkan, they were more than willing to contribute, and they brought their husbands along with them. In addition to that, they had this incredible talent of spinning the wool on the backs of the goats. Now, the Rebbe explains that that was to show their enthusiasm, that they were so enthusiastic for making things for the Mishkan that they didn't wait to sharing the wool, they did it on the goats. But the Rebbe adds another important thing, that other commentaries say, but the Rebbe adds that a lot of people have talents. And what do they do with their talents? They use it for various purposes, or they don't use it. Either one is inadequate. If God gives us a talent, we have to use it. God does not give something to us for no good reason, as long as the talent is obviously something that is legitimate and legal and moral. But in addition to that, every talent that we have, we should make an attempt to channel it and apply it to the service of God. So if you have a beautiful voice, sing praise to God. If you have musical abilities, use it to bring joy to people in a spiritual venue. Whatever talent you have, use it to serve God. The women had this talent. They were able to spin the wool. They said, why did God give us this talent? What is it for? They realized it's for the Mishkan. Right after, it talks about the women bringing their wool, spinning the wool. It talks about the leaders. Every tribe had its nasi, its leader. And what did they bring? So the Torah says in verse 27, they brought the shoham stones and the stones for the settings for the ephod and the breastplate. They brought the jewels. And Rashi explains that they were the last ones to contribute. They didn't contribute initially, together with all the rest of the people. Why? So Rashi says, because they said, let everyone else do whatever they'll do, and whatever is missing, we'll bring. And it turned out that everything was contributed. There was no need for any more contributions. So at the end, they brought the gems, the jewels, because everything else was already contributed. Well, what does that tell you? And Rashi uses the term, actually, that they were lazy. They tarried. And that's in contrast to the women. The women, not only did they do it enthusiastically, but they did it with dispatch. They didn't even wait to shear the wool off the goats. And the leaders waited until everything else was done. Although the Rebbe qualifies that and turns it into less than laziness. It wasn't really laziness. It just meant that they felt that their responsibility was to see that the people fulfill their responsibilities. That's what a leader is. So they felt, yes, we could contribute, but that's as private citizens, our main role is to see that everyone else does their job. And that is the reason why they justified their tarrying. Now, the second Parsha, which talks about the accounting, Pekudei, talks about how Moses gave an accounting for the Mishkan. And there's a certain amount in chapter 38, verse 27. Verse 28. It talks about the 1,000, the 100 talents of silver were to cast the sockets of the sanctuary and the sockets of the partition, 100 sockets for 100 talents, a talent per socket. And then it says, and from the 1,775 he made hooks for the pillars, covered their tops and banded them. So this 1,750 and 75, 1,775 rather, it says in the Medrash that Moshe initially didn't know what happened to that amount, and he said right away the people are going to be suspicious of him. What did he do with that? And then until he figured out that it was for the hooks. And Meir Shapiro was one of the great leaders of Jewry pre-Holocaust Poland. He was a member of the Polish Parliament. He is the founder of the Daf Yomi, studying a page of Talmud a day, but his greatest contribution was the establishment of the most important academic institution in Europe, Jewish institution, the Yeshiva Chachmei Lublin in the city of Lublin. And he was known for his wit. And he said, isn't it very interesting that the Jewish people contributed so much gold, and what came out? One measly calf. And no one complained. Where did the gold go? Let's get an accounting for it. And here, if Moses couldn't come up with an exact accounting of every little detail, all of a sudden everyone wants a major accounting, wants a review of everything. Look what came out, a beautiful Mishkan, not just a measly calf. So it seems that when money is used for wasteful things, for bad things, no one is looking for an accounting. It's when something is used for something good, all of a sudden you have all this opposition. It's an interesting phenomenon that when someone does something bad, I might get a little criticism. But when someone does something good, everyone says, no, he should have done this, I could have done it better. There's always room for criticism when something is done for something good. The reason for that, I'll leave for the viewers and the listeners to figure out the psychology behind that. But that was Meir Shapiro's very witty observation. Now, why is it so important to count everything in the Mishkan? And the answer is so that no one should suspect that the people who built the Mishkan kept some of the money, some of the materials for themselves. Now, why should you care if people think that you stole something if you know that your conscience is clean? If I know that I didn't do anything wrong, why do I have to defend myself? Why do I have to prove to people that I'm not a thief? I know I'm not a thief. I know that, and God knows that, so that's enough. And the answer is no, it's not enough. There's a commandment in the Torah although it's not counted as one of the 613 as far as I can remember. I don't know anyone who counts it as such. But there is a commandment in the Torah, v'heyisem nikiyim, you have to be clean, innocent. This is a story when Moses was told by two tribes that they don't want to cross the Jordan. They want to get their share in the land on the east bank of the Jordan. Moses was very upset. He says, you're just like your ancestors. You're trying to rebel against God and you're not going into Israel. And they said, no, Moses. We're going to go over with our brother. We'll fight with them. But afterwards, we'll come back here. So he tells them, you better make that clear that you're going over, you're crossing over, so you should be innocent. No one should suspect you that you're really not trying to do the right thing. So from that we learn that a person is not allowed to be in a position where he causes other people to suspect. You always have to clear your record. There should be no appearance of impropriety. And the reason for that is twofold. Number one, if you're an important person in particular, and you do something that has the appearance of impropriety, you are going to get other people to say, well, if the rabbi can do it, I can do it as well. The fact that the rabbi didn't do what you thought he did is not going to stop you, because you just see what you think you saw, and you're not going to ask the rabbi what caused it, why did he do it, and you'll just follow him. So you're actually causing other people to sin because of your appearance of impropriety. And the second reason is that if the other people don't follow your example, but they suspect you, you're causing other people to sin, because it's a sin to suspect an innocent person. And since you're innocent and they suspect you, you're causing them to sin, so you have to remove that suspicion. And perhaps the third reason is that when people see an important person in particular doing something that they think is wrong, even though it isn't, then it creates what is called a chilul Hashem, desecration of God's name. The mere fact that people could say that a spiritual person has done something wrong creates a desecration of God's name. That God and people who represent Him don't look like they're really doing the right thing, and that's not the proper thing for us to do. So that's why Moses was so careful with the accounting over here, that no one should say that Moses did anything untoward. Now here's a little bit of a mystical discussion. There's a principle in the Talmud that if you want blessings to come into your life, into your activities, into your resources, the more discreet things are, the more the blessing. In fact, the Talmud puts it very strongly. Ein habracha mitzuya ela al davar hasamui min ha'ayin. That God's blessing does not frequent itself except something that is hidden from the eye. That's why we don't flaunt the things that we have, because once they become public, there's no more blessing. That's what the Talmud says. So why over here do we have Moses giving a precise accounting? Isn't that going to preclude blessing? And one of the Hasidic masters, known as the Avnei Nezer, Rabbi Avram of Sachachev, says as follows. He says, according to the teachings of Kabbalah, there are forces in this world that are negative, that God created in order to give us a challenge. But He gives negative forces limited power. If they had unlimited power, we of course couldn't survive. And He said to them, your power, you could mess things up only if they are exposed, only if they're visible. If they're not visible, you can't go beneath the surface to ruin things. What does that tell you? That when things are covered up, that's where they are secure. God did not give the evil forces power to destroy, to compromise, to contaminate the things that are hidden. And that parallels also our souls. That there's a part of our soul that's hidden within us that can't be corrupted. It's only the overt parts of our personality that can be corrupted, not the inner part of our soul. And that's true in general throughout the universe. What's hidden is protected. When it's exposed, you're inviting challenges, you're inviting struggle, and sometimes we have no choice because we don't live our lives in a cave, but whatever we could keep under wraps, so to speak, is more protected. So Rabbi Avram of Sakhachov says, that's true with everyone except for Moses. Why? Because Moses personified the trait of emes, of truth. Everyone who's righteous is truthful. But truth doesn't just mean not lying. Truth means totally consistent. Totally consistent. And therefore, Moses, who personified emes, truth, didn't have to worry about exposing things. Why? Because the negative forces can't stand up to truth. The reason why negative forces have power over us is because we invite them in by our own inconsistencies, by our own negatives, which is the absence of truth. Moses, who personified absolute truth, was able to expose things in the open, and they would not be subject to any type of contamination and damage by the external forces, as they're called. Later on, the Torah talks about the different parts of the garments of the Kohen, the priest, and it talks about the ephod was like an apron, and the choshen was the breastplate, and they had to be together. The Torah says you cannot separate one from the other. So what's the symbolism behind that? Why couldn't you separate the apron? It was like an apron worn on the back, and then there was suspenders like attached to the breastplate, which had 12 jewels in them. And they had to always be connected. So commentaries explain that the choshen, the breastplate, represents justice. It's called choshen hamishpat, the breastplate of justice. When people violated the principles of justice, the choshen, the breastplate that the high priest would wear, served as an atonement for it. The ephod, the apron, was an atonement for idol worship. Those are the two categories of the things that we do to serve God. Idol worship is the antithesis of believing and serving one God, and justice is the antithesis of the breakdown of relationships with other people when there's injustice. And the two had to be connected, because you can't separate, commentaries say, the laws that govern our relationship with God from the laws that govern our relationship with other people. The two are intertwined. They are interconnected. You can't separate. People who say, well, I will serve God, but I don't care about humanity, that's not called serving God. And people who say, I'll just serve humanity, but I can leave God out of it, that means that you're not really serving humanity. Now, the same lesson was already introduced earlier when Moses comes down with the two tablets. The first tablet dealt with man to God obligations. I am the Lord your God, don't have any other gods, don't remember my name in vain, remember the Sabbath, and even honoring parents is considered to be honoring God. The next tablet, don't commit murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, and don't covet, deals with the relationships with other people. And these two tablets were brought down together to emphasize the symbiotic relationship between the man to God and the man to man commandments. So that lesson we already had before. So my question is, why do we need two lessons? But that's not such a strong question. The more lessons we have, the better it is for us. But the breastplate and the apron had to be attached together. They couldn't be separated. The two tablets, which by the way were cubes, not round on the top, the two tablets were two separate tablets that Moses held together, but they were not attached to each other. Why not attached? If the lesson is so vital that we don't separate one from the other, it would be better if they would have been attached to each other. So the answer, I think, is, and everyone is welcome to suggest their own answer to the question, is that tablets represent the ideals of relationship with God as they're contained in the Torah. Torah study about these relationships. What the breastplate and the apron that was worn by the high priest represented was translating those ideals from the Torah into practice. In Torah, when you're dealing with theory, you can talk about one subject and you have to separate it from the other, because those are two separate subjects. The rules that govern our relationship with God are not necessarily the same as the rules that govern our relationship with other people. So when you're talking about the theory, the concept, they're two separate concepts. When you're talking about practice, you have to practice them together as one. You can't separate one from the other. Then it says Moshe blesses them. What did he bless them? So Rashi says, he said, Yehi Ratzon, may it be the will that the divine presence shall dwell in the doings of your hands. So there's a beautiful commentary by Ksav Sofer. He was a 19th century rabbi in the city of Preshburg, which is now Bratislava. And in his commentary on the Torah, he says this very beautiful thing. What is that? What kind of blessing is that? May it be the will that the divine presence rests in the doings of your hands. So he said two things. Number one, it doesn't say may it be God's will. It says may it be the will. Whose will? And he says your will. God wants to dwell amongst you. It has to be our will. May it be the will of the person, of the people who built the Mishkan, who built the tabernacle. They should want, because when you're involved in a construction project, you may get caught up with the construction itself, with the beauty of the architecture, with the beautiful results, and you may say, this was a beautiful project. I really did so much good in making this. I can take credit for it. No, that should not be your will. Your will should be that this structure should bring the divine presence into this world. And that's true about every mitzvah that we do. Very often the mitzvahs that we do bring us honor, they bring us satisfaction, they bring us joy, and that's fine, that's good. But the will should be that our mitzvahs should also bring the divine presence in our midst. But also it says here, the divine presence shall dwell in the doings of your hands. And as some say, that this is to tell you that it's not enough that you're inspired with the Shekhinah, with the divine presence that dwells within your heart. It has to dwell in your hands as well. There are people who are very spiritual, but I know a lot of people who will tell me, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Now, I don't know what religious means, because that can be a whole discussion, what it means. But if it means I'm not observant, I don't practice, what they're saying essentially is that my relationship with God has nothing to do with my body. It's my heart, I feel this closeness with God. And that's a wonderful feeling. But it has to translate in your hands, in your doings of your hand. This would be similar to the person who says, I really love to help poor people. I feel terrible that there are poor people. And someone comes to you and asks you for a donation and says, I'm sorry, I cannot contribute. It's not my way of doing things, but I feel their pain. We hear so many people saying, I feel their pain. But when it comes to taking their hands, putting their hands in their pocket and taking out money to give, to contribute, all of a sudden that feeling dissipates. Let's go to the very last words of the book of Exodus. You have to imagine, if the book of Exodus is about the Exodus, that's why it's called Exodus, because the highlight of this book is the Exodus of the Jewish people from Egypt. So we have to imagine that, consistent with a principle in Judaism, that everything follows the end, the seal, the bottom line. What is the bottom line here? The last verse of Exodus talks about how God dwelled in the Mishkan and how the Jewish people would travel based on the cloud when the cloud would remove itself from the Mishkan and would start moving, they would move along with it. And the last verse reads, "For the cloud of God would be on the tabernacle by day, and fire would be on it at night, before the eyes of all of the house of Israel, throughout their journeys." So Rashi says that whenever they traveled, the cloud would dwell in the place where they would encamp. And Rashi then says, even where they encamped is also called a journey. Why? Because after encamping, they would continue their journey. So even when the Torah says in all their journeys, it doesn't just mean when they were traveling, because it says the cloud was on the Mishkan. The cloud was only on the Mishkan when they were resting, not traveling. So this tells us that even when you're traveling, when you're resting, you're traveling. What does that have to do with the Exodus? And the answer is very clear. Throughout history, we have been journeying and traveling, and resting, traveling and resting. When we travel, when that means in terms of history, when Jews are forced to go from one place to another, the wandering Jew, we are not in our own land. We went through one exile and another. That's called a journey. When you're journeying and you're wandering from one place to another, you know that there's an ultimate goal. You have to get to the promised land. You're journeying towards the Messianic age, to the coming of Mashiach and the rebuilding of the third temple. But when Jews finally encamped, when Jews had a respite, they had the Golden Age in Spain, relatively speaking. That was a time of rest. Then all of a sudden, Jews got comfortable in exile and stopped focusing on continuing the journey until they get to the promised land. Even more so after World War II, before World War II, but especially after World War II, and the United States of America and other Western countries became such a good place for the Jewish people. Now even the former Soviet Union is a positive place, gives Jews religious freedom. Not perfect, no place is perfect, but it's great, it's better than it ever was. Now we have Israel. Jews can live there. True, there are problems, but it's still where we encamp. So the Torah is telling us, no, this is not the end of the journey. We're still in the middle of our journey until we get to the promised land. Until we build the third temple, we are still journeying. And though we have the cloud of God over us, He's protecting us, He's guiding us, but we're not resting. We are just pausing to get the strength and the energy to go to the next journey. And now we're at the point where we're ready for the ultimate final journey to take us into the era of redemption. Just want to mention that this Shabbos is the 27th day of Adar. That's the day the Rebbe in 1992 had a stroke that prevented him from speaking. And the Rebbe a few weeks before that said, speaking about his predecessor, the previous Rebbe who couldn't speak well, that we have to become the Aarons. Just like Moses had a speech impediment, we have to become the Aarons to communicate his message. So it's our role to teach Torah and teach the inner teachings of Torah and promote the message that the Rebbe gave us repeatedly, that we're the last generation of exile. We're right before the promised land. We're going to be the first generation of redemption, and all it will take is for any one of us to do even one more mitzvah that will bring us over the top and take us out of exile into the final destination, which is the coming of Mashiach and the ultimate redemption. A good week, and God willing, next week we'll continue the book of Leviticus, Vayikra.
Good. That's a lot to do. Question. Are we ready?
Someone asked there, is it okay for us to eat pork?
Yeah.
Are we still on?
Yeah, we're still on.
No, we cannot eat pork. Neither when we're building the Mishkan or not building it. Pork is off limits to every Jew. But if you're not Jewish, you could eat pork.
Is that a question you didn't ask?
Yeah.
Yes, on the screen.
Okay. Are you done?
Yes.